It looks like there are many dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom, more than I expected. As more and more time goes on, as we analyze this trailer, as more details come out, it's looking like the amount of large-scale dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom is fairly significant. Now, we don't have proof of this, but what I can say is that from what I'm seeing so far, there's at least 4, but I'm thinking a lot more. And that's what we're talking about today.
Hey, listen!
Welcome everyone, this is Andre's Restart. I believe we are getting a lot of major dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom. But before we jump into things, let me point out that we are aiming to hit 25,000 subscribers by the time Tears of the Kingdom comes out on May 12th. So if you enjoy my content, please subscribe and hit that notification bell, because then we might just make it. So how many dungeons could there just be? Well, before making this video, I was thinking that we could be seeing somewhere between 7 to 9 dungeons. And the reasoning behind this has to do with the Tears of the Kingdom. So in one of the earlier trailers for Tears of the Kingdom, we see this shot of this Zone-like character that has these different tiers surrounding it, and there were 7. Which makes a lot of sense because the number 7 is important to the Zelda series. We've had the 7 sages, we've had the 7 heroines, so this could be matching up to that. And what's interesting about the 7 heroines from Breath of the Wild, they are actually another representation of the 7 sages. But what makes this more interesting though, is that there's actually a secret 8th heroine, perhaps suggesting a secret 8th sage. So that's how I've gone to maybe thinking, okay, maybe there's going to be a tier in a major dungeon throughout Tears of the Kingdom, and since there's maybe 8 heroines, or maybe 8 sages, or maybe 8 tiers, that gets me to the number 8, or somewhere between 7 and 8. But then when I've thought about the final boss, that also being a final dungeon as it usually is, that's what gets me to 9. So that's why I've had this range of 7 to 9 dungeons. And I think that's probably the range we're looking at. However, there is this theory going around that maybe there's more than 7 tiers, more than 8 or 9 tiers even. There might be 14 tiers, or the way I'm thinking about it, could go as even high as 16 tiers. Which may seem like a very lofty number, and it could be. Keep in mind this is a theory, but consider this for a moment. What if there's a tier that matches to another tier? What if the 8 tiers that we're thinking of have a corresponding pair? And I say 8 because of the 8th heroine idea. We've only been shown 7 on the one screen. But going back to that same trailer, they do show us imagery of 2 tiers coming together when they show these 2 different characters coming together. And what if each tier is located in different parts of the world, each one being a part of another dungeon? Is there anything in the game that we've seen so far that supports this idea? Maybe, actually. So now let's talk about the dungeons we kind of know about or we've seen evidence of. So in the trailer, there's this part where they show us holes in the desert, which I do think is hinting at a dungeon, because then afterwards they show us a shot of Link running through this underground lava area, which I also think is referencing some kind of dungeon, because then after that they show us these wind boats by the giant tornado above Hylia Mountain, and then shortly after that they show us Link jumping through some giant water orbs. So I think this is meant to be a hint towards the elemental dungeons: earth, water, wind, fire, the 4 classic-like elements. Now I know earth is kind of weird for Zelda, but the desert, lightning, those are all sort of correspond to that kind of dungeon. But I do think that's what they were hinting at with these pieces of footage, for a lot of different reasons actually. One, the lava area seems to be probably in Death Mountain because we're seeing a lot of lava and it's a large area. So I think the fact that they show Death Mountain in the Tears of the Kingdom art with all that mouse coming out, it's drawing attention to it, the same way the giant tornado is drawing attention to it as well. And we know that Link and Toland are exploring this giant tornado above Hylia Mountain from what we've seen of the footage. But what's interesting is that it's Link and Toland he's a companion character to Link. And this is reminiscent of those events we saw in the Wind Waker, where we would go and challenge these dungeons with a companion character like Maker or Medley. And what's interesting is that Breath of the Wild also had a mechanic kind of like this. They just didn't join us with the actual dungeons, but they were part of the lead up. It's possible it's exactly the same this time around as well, but it's looking like it's at least a little different, because if you look at Tolan, he has this bluish green-like energy surrounding him. And we've seen footage of Link and Tolan fighting a giant ice Goma in the air. I say ice Goma because it looks like a giant arachnid, which is usually what Goma is. Basically a boss fight, the kind of boss fight that in previous Zeldas would be probably for some particular major dungeon. So that giant ice beast could be related to a big dungeon in the sky for the Hebra area, the Wind Dungeon or the Ice Dungeon. But to further support this idea, we've also seen gameplay with Link and Sidon. Link and Sidon are fighting alongside of each other. We can see they've worked on the AI of the game where you can have companion characters fighting the same enemy with you, which is very interesting, and Sidon has that same blue-like energy as Tolan. And we know both these characters eventually get their own tiers, and they seem to be basically the champion successors. Or perhaps sages, tying us back to this idea of the different tiers and the sages. But what I want to focus on here is what I believe to be the water dungeon. If Sidon is a Zora and it's related to a dungeon, it's likely to be a water dungeon. But if you look at the environment, we can see waterfalls, we can see vases. It looks like likely the water dungeon. And actually, I think we've seen several scenes of this. So that scene where Link is jumping into the water orb, I think this is the same area where we are fighting alongside with Sidon. For supporting the idea that those 4 shots of the desert, the underground lava area, the flying boats by the tornado, and these water orbs to be dungeons, because I think it's likely that Link and the champions will be going towards dungeons together. And if you just believe that it's part of the same area, take a look at those blue particles you're seeing. I believe these blue particles represent an anti-gravity area of effect, because every time we see the blue particles, it looks like the gravity is in question. So here Link is having these spacey-like jumps into the water orb, but there's this other piece of footage where Link is jumping onto these green platforms with another space jump kind of like effect, but in the distance you can see those same water orbs, same area, and also waterfalls all around. And if you'll notice, from this shot here, it's actually south of Death Mountain, and south of Death Mountain is above Zora's domain. So stick with me here. That shot that shows Link doing the moon jumps over the green platforms, if you look off into the distance around the middle of the screen, you're going to see this dark golden-like goop dripping downwards. And what's interesting about this is that we have seen footage of these dark lines in the background hitting the surface around Zora's domain. The theory is there is this dark goop coming from this water dungeon in the sky that is contaminating the waters of Zora's domain. So eventually Link and Sidon will come together to the sky to solve this problem. And that is kind of the typical sort of storyline for a dungeon where there's some sort of curse or problem that's affecting an area, and then they go to the dungeon to solve said problem. And all these areas are linked by this anti-gravity effect, these blue particles. Even the scene with Link and Sidon, you can see it off to the left side. But also, if you look carefully, on the floor just behind them, there's some more of that dark goop. It's not malice, it's more representative of that same goop we saw dripping down just beyond where Link was jumping on those green platforms. We even see Link fighting a goop shark where there's also blue particles. So I think this is all around the same area. These sky islands above Zora's domain that have a lot of water things going on. We see the water orbs, we see the giant vases with the waterfall going into it. Sidon is fighting alongside Link, there's anti-gravity. I think it's all related. But going back to what I was talking about earlier, how there could be 2 tiers that correspond to each other, what if there are 2 different types of water dungeons? This water dungeon is in the sky, and that's exciting, but with a water dungeon in the sky, there's no underwater element. And if there's no underwater exploration in this game, that might be a smart choice to avoid that problem. But as we've discussed in previous videos, we've seen that we can use Ascend when we're underwater briefly. potentially suggesting that there could be some level of additional underwater exploration. It's not confirmed, it's simply speculated. But what if there is still underwater exploration? Just because they haven't shown us it doesn't mean it's not in the game. What we've seen with this trailer is likely still just scratching the surface of the kind of content we're going to get in this game. Nintendo's been very quiet about this game. They've given us only what they've needed to give. They want us to not be spoiled going into this experience. So what if there's another dungeon that's maybe, I don't know, where usually water dungeons are in Lake Hylia? Well, we got some recent footage from the Tears of the Kingdom Japanese website, and there is a whirlpool on the surface of Lake Hylia, suggesting that there's something under the water, somewhere we could go. So maybe there is another water dungeon. So hear me out here. Maybe one water dungeon is like the anti-gravity dungeon, the one in the sky, as we discussed. But maybe another dungeon is just straight up a typical underwater style dungeon, and that's accessed through that whirlpool on Lake Hylia. So then you would have two different types of water dungeons that would be very different from each other. And going back to the dungeon above Hero Mountain, that's a wind-related dungeon, but it's also a very cold area. Why can't there also maybe be an ice dungeon? And interestingly, going back to the desert area, we see all those giant holes, and maybe that relates to a big dungeon underground the desert. But what about that other shot that shows this giant structure rising from the underground of the desert? That might be an entirely separate area we explore, and given how large it is, it's kind of hard for me to believe that it's not also related to some kind of dungeon, or at least pertaining to a big story element. So if those giant holes in the desert aren't related to this big structure that rose from the desert, that also might be two different dungeons. Of course, that is just speculation, and there's not a lot of evidence to go off of it, so for sure, take this theory with a grain of salt. And to offer a little bit more of a counter argument, that giant area we see underground with the lava and the mine carts and everything, these giant structures, I think this could lead to a fire dungeon. I think that is probably what's going to happen. But if we look off into the distance, we can see this underground root system with that yellow sort of like core to it. We've seen this before. In the prior trailer, we see another underground area that has this big like root with a yellow core. So it might be the case that this is simply a large underground area that isn't a dungeon. But what are dungeons this time around? Look at the sky islands that I think are representing a water dungeon. It's just a whole bunch of platforms in the sky. What dungeons are in Tears of the Kingdom may be completely different from any dungeons we've seen in prior Zelda games, including Breath of the Wild. It also potentially could simply be the lead up to a fire dungeon, and it's in a large cavernous fire area. But to make clear what I actually believe, I don't think there are going to be 16 or 17 large-scale dungeons. That just seems like a bit too much. I would love to be wrong on that, but that's what I think. However, what if the 7 tiers that were shown, those tiers can correspond to each other? Maybe there's an 8th tier. Maybe each of those tiers could correspond to each other and they can make up to 4 pairs. Then it would only perhaps suggest 8 major dungeons and maybe one final boss fight dungeon leading up to 9. To me, that feels a lot more believable. Especially if these dungeons are going to be very large scale and expansive. I think that's going to be fine, alongside a whole bunch of shrines and side quests and just an overall larger world to explore with a better told story and new gameplay possibilities. But I think that could still be a far larger, even more content-rich game than Breath of the Wild. So if I'm going to make a prediction, I'm going to predict that there are 9 major dungeons. And I think there could be a relation here. I do think that Whirlpool has a great chance to be related to a major dungeon, given that it's where Lake Hylia is, where historically we have gone to many water dungeons. But I also think that those sky islands that we explore with Sidon are related to a big problem that is threatening Zora's domain, and is also probably somehow a water dungeon. So I kind of like this idea how there may be some corresponding tiers But it's also possible not every dungeon awards you a tier. There could be different things we have to collect or do throughout the course of the game. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. This is Andres Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.